In spring of 1884 in Ohio Valley apple country, while growers counted blossoms under a warm May sun, Ronald Calder hauled burlap and lit smudge fires beneath a clear sky. The guild expelled him. No black frost was forecast. But he'd seen signs, still crickets, a ring around the moon. If wrong, his orchard would suffocate. If right, the frost would kill every other orchard. What did Ronald Calder see that they didn't? Ronald Calder was no mystic, just an orchardist who had spent 30 years reading frost the way sailors read tide. In a valley where every grower lived by the almanac and the guild's collective wisdom, he had noticed something shifting. The old signals were no longer reliable. The spring peepers had fallen silent too early. The moon had worn a halo for 3 nights running. To him, those were not superstitions. They were a clock, and the clock warned of a black frost coming not in winter, but in full bloom. The guild didn't see a prophet. They saw a man sowing fear that could collapse prices before the fruit even set. So they stripped his membership and ordered him silent. He returned to his orchard alone, knowing that if he was right, every other tree in the valley would wake one morning to black death, except perhaps his own. The Ohio River Valley of 1884 did not forgive independent thought. For decades, the apple growers there had operated as a tight guild, a council of elders who shared weather forecasts like scripture, who opened their orchards to the same pruning schedules, the same spray regimens, the same articles of faith. The valley's prosperity rested on a single, fragile window, the apple bloom in late April and early May. If frost struck those blossoms, the entire year's crop, and the livelihoods of hundreds of families, turned to black mush on the branch. Ronald Calder had served on that guild council for 11 years. He owned the largest orchard in Henderson County, 160 acres of Baldwin and Northern Spy trees that he had planted himself when he was barely 22, pushing roots into limestone soil that most men considered worthless. By 57, his hands were more scar than skin. He had lost entire harvests to early freezes before, had watched his father lose a farm to a single bad October. That history was not unusual in the valley. What set Ronald apart was the obsessive record-keeping he had maintained in a series of leather-bound ledgers, the kind no other grower bothered to keep. For 3 decades, he had logged not just temperatures and bloom dates, but the behavior of the natural world that preceded hard weather. The day the spring peepers stopped singing, the thickness of the woolly bear caterpillar's band, the precise shade of gray that settled over the western hills before a killing frost, the interval between a haloed moon and the temperature drop that followed. He had correlated those signs with 63 frost events, and he believed the pattern was clear. When crickets fell silent in the last week of April, when the moon wore a ring for 3 consecutive nights, and when the dawn sky held that peculiar pale green tint he called glass light, a black frost would follow within 4 to 6 days, not in winter, but during full bloom, the season when such events were considered impossible by all reputable almanacs. On April 29, 1884, Ronald walked into the guild hall beneath the old stone meeting house in Henderson, carrying a sheaf of his notes. The council was already in session, debating shipment contracts to Pittsburgh. He laid his evidence on the table and told them that a black frost was coming no later than May 4th. The temperature, he argued, would drop below 25 degrees Fahrenheit in the hours before dawn, cold enough to freeze the sap inside the tender bloom stems, to split the cell walls of the nascent fruit. He urged a coordinated preparation. Every grower should cover his youngest trees with burlap, should stockpile pruned wood and damp straw for smudge fires, should wet the ground between rows to hold the day's heat into the night. The room fell silent. The guild chairman, a white-haired man named Harlan Cross who had chaired the council since the war, removed his spectacles and looked at Ronald as though he had just proposed consulting witch hazel twigs. The almanac, the farmer's almanac upon which half the valley staked its calendar, predicted mild temperatures through mid-May. The bureau in Cincinnati had wired no frost warning. The sky was clear. The bloom was the fullest in memory. To call a sudden preparation now would mean diverting labor when every hand was needed for thinning buds and spreading manure. Worse, a false alarm would shake the confidence of the railroad buyers and the cider mills, perhaps sinking prices before the season even began. Growers around the table began to murmur. Some laughed openly. They called him Black Frost Ronald, accused him of trying to manipulate the market by scaring others into selling futures low so he could buy them cheap. Harlan Cross delivered the Guild's judgment. Ronald Calder was stripped of his voting rights and formally censured. He was to make no further public statements regarding weather. If he persisted, he would be expelled entirely and his orchard boycotted by every broker who did business with the Guild. He was told to go home and tend his trees and leave the prophecy to fools and almanacs. Ronald left the meeting hall in silence, walked the 3 miles back to his orchard as the afternoon sun warmed the blossoming branches, heavy with pink and white petals. His wife, Margaret, was waiting on the porch, and she knew the moment she saw his face what had happened. They had been married 32 years. She had watched him lose arguments before, but never one where the cost of losing was measured in the life of every tree they owned. That evening Ronald sat at the kitchen table, not sharpening cedar stakes as Parker Vale had done, but sketching the layout of his orchard, marking every tree younger than 10 years, every low branch that could be wrapped, every wind corridor where cold air would pool. He had not expected the Guild to believe him. He had prepared his own materials quietly over the previous 2 weeks, rolls of coarse burlap, hanks of twine, iron smoke pots he had salvaged from a defunct brickyard. He had done everything short of lighting the fires. Now, the Guild had taken away his name and his standing, but they could not take away the burlap stacked in the barn. They could not forbid him from protecting his own property. If he was wrong, the ridicule would bury him. His fruit would rot on the branch for lack of buyers. His debts would swallow the farm. If he was right, the Guild would learn that the only thing worse than a false alarm was the truth they refused to hear. The following day, the 1st of May, Ronald began. He did not ask permission. He did not explain himself to neighbors. He rose before dawn, hitched the draft horses, and started dragging bolts of burlap down the rows of his youngest Baldwin block. With Margaret and his 2 grown sons, Caleb and Elijah, he wrapped the trunks and lower scaffolds of over 800 trees. Not the whole orchard, that was impossible with the labor they had, but the most vulnerable 50 acres, the trees whose blossoms held the future of the farm. The burlap was stiff and heavy, and tying it securely around a living tree without breaking the blossom clusters required a slow, careful hand. They worked until their fingers cramped. By midday, word had spread through the valley. Neighbors rode their horses along the fence line to watch. Some shouted advice laced with mockery. "Expecting a snowstorm in May, Ronald," one man called. Another reminded him that the Guild had spoken. Ronald's sons said nothing, but their faces hardened. Margaret stood in the yard, her hands wrapped in canvas gloves, and when a neighbor asked her why she was humoring her husband's foolishness, she replied without even looking up, "Because he's been right before, and you've never once bet your barn on the weather." But burlap alone was not enough. Ronald knew that a black frost, a radiation freeze that happened under clear, calm skies, could strip the heat from the ground so quickly that fabric alone would not hold it. The trees needed a blanket of warm air close to the soil, something to break the inversion. So on May 2nd, he began hauling the smudge pots and setting out piles of damp straw mixed with green pruned branches that would burn slow and smoky, not hot. He placed them at intervals, 50 feet apart, in the lanes between the burlapped rows. He dug narrow trenches and filled them with water so the soil would absorb the sun's warmth during the day and release it at night. He was not fighting the frost. He was building a microclimate, a pocket of warmth that would last just long enough for the coldest hours to pass. The older growers in the valley, the ones who had been planting since before the canal era, did not mock him. They watched with a different kind of silence. Some of them had seen strange weather before, had noticed the same signs Ronald had recorded, but they had never dared to trust their own eyes against the collective wisdom of the Guild. One of them, a man named Silas Burke who owned a small orchard near the river, stopped his wagon and asked Ronald quietly what he was really seeing. Ronald pointed to the western sky, where a faint ring was already forming around the moon that afternoon, a lunar halo, exactly as his journals predicted. That ring means ice crystals high up, a dry cold mass moving down, he said. When it meets the ground on a still night, it'll pull every degree of heat right out of the bloom. Silas Burke rode home and began covering his own young trees that night. He told no one. By the evening of May 3rd, the valley was bathed in a strange quiet. The crickets had stopped chirping entirely, as if a switch had been thrown. The robins that normally crowded the orchards had gone still. The air felt heavier, colder, even as the sun set in a cloudless sky. Ronald stood in his barn doorway, looking over the burlap-wrapped rows and the dark smudge pots waiting to be lit. His sons were exhausted. Margaret had packed provisions as if for a siege, and the guild members who had spent the day laughing at the crazy man in Henderson County were preparing to sleep soundly under a sky that looked perfectly kind. But Ronald Calder knew something they did not. The frost would not come like a storm with wind and warning. It would drop silently past midnight, invisible, draining the heat from the blossom, until the sap turned to ice and the cells burst. And the only thing standing between his trees and that quiet, murderous cold was a layer of rough burlap and a pile of wet straw that had not yet been lit. The real test had not even begun. The temperature didn't fall gradually that night. It collapsed. At 11 o'clock the air still held a mildness that could have fooled a man standing on his porch. By half past midnight, the mercury had dropped 14 degrees in under an hour, and the first skin of ice formed on the water trenches Ronald had dug between the burlap-wrapped rows. He felt the change before he saw the thermometer. It was the way the night went dead quiet, not the stillness of a calm evening, but the hollow silence of a world holding its breath. The barn swallows that chattered beneath the eaves had vanished. Even the horses stood motionless in their stalls, coats fluffed against a cold they sensed before any instrument could measure it. Ronald had not gone to bed. Margaret had lain down in her clothes, but he had stayed on the porch, watching the western sky where the halo around the moon had thickened into a milky ring so bright it cast shadows on the grass. He knew what that meant. High-altitude ice crystals, dense enough to refract moonlight, thin enough to let the Earth's heat escape straight upward into the void. The perfect conditions for a radiation freeze, the kind of frost that needed no wind, no storm, no warning. Just a clear sky and a still night and the sudden, violent theft of every degree of warmth from the soil. He had seen it before in 1869, when a May frost had killed half the valley's peach crop in 4 hours. But that freeze had been mild compared to what he felt now pressing against his skin. The air had teeth. At midnight he woke his sons. Caleb stumbled from the loft, still pulling on his coat. Elijah the younger came out with a lantern and a bucket of coal oil. The smudge pots had been laid out in precise lines, 73 of them, each one a salvaged iron kettle packed with damp straw and green apple prunings that would burn slow and thick. The key was not heat. A smudge fire never burned hot enough to warm the air around it more than a few degrees. The key was smoke, a dense, low blanket that would trap the ground's own heat beneath it, holding the warmth like a lid on a pot. If the smoke rose too high or dispersed sideways, the frost would slide underneath and kill everything it touched. Ronald walked the first line alone, touching each pot with a soaked torch, watching the straw catch and then smother itself in a rolling gray cloud. The smoke didn't rise. It pooled at ground level and spread horizontally, creeping through the orchard aisles like floodwater filling a basement. In a quarter hour, the entire burlap-wrapped block was submerged beneath a shallow sea of smoke, so thick that walking through it meant losing sight of your own boots. Ronald moved through it by memory, one hand trailing along the bark of a Baldwin trunk, feeling for the slight roughness of the burlap ties. Margaret came out at 1 o'clock carrying a pot of hot coffee and a blanket, and she found her husband standing in the middle of the smoke field, lantern held chest-high, head tilted as though listening. The temperature had dropped below freezing now, 29 degrees and falling fast. The puddles in the water trenches had frosted over despite the smoke. She could see her own breath turning to ice crystals on the wool of her scarf. But under the burlap, under the smoke, the ground temperature was holding at 34 degrees, a thin margin, no wider than a knife blade but still alive. The calm is the enemy, Ronald told her without looking away from the sky. If the wind picks up at all, it'll scrub this smoke clean away. We'll have 10 minutes, maybe less, before the inversion collapses and the cold eats the bloom. They didn't have to wait long. Just before 3 in the morning, a breath of air stirred across the orchard. Not a wind, just a drift, light as a whisper, but enough to tear a hole in the smoke blanket over the eastern block. Ronald saw it happen. A patch of starry sky opened above the youngest northern spy row, and the smoke curled away like a curtain pulled back. The trees in that gap were exposed to the full bite of the radiation freeze. He started running before he'd even finished the thought, shouting for Caleb to bring another smudge pot, for Elijah to pull the oil-soaked rags from the storage shed. Margaret grabbed a shovel and began dragging wet earth over the trench water, desperate to hold the heat in the soil. For 20 minutes they fought the gap with everything they had. Ronald positioned a fresh pot directly under the open patch and loaded it with green pine boughs, the oiliest fuel they had, the kind that would produce the thickest, heaviest smoke. Caleb lit the pot and the pine caught with a roar, sending up a column of black smoke that bent sideways in the drift, then slumped back down as the air stilled again. The patch of sky disappeared behind a fresh layer of gray. When Ronald checked the bark of the northern spy nearest the gap, he found a thin rime of frost already forming on the outer branches. But the inner buds, the ones wrapped close to the trunk, were still soft, still pink, still alive. He'd held the line by minutes. By 4 o'clock the crisis had passed, but the cold had not eased. The mercury bottomed out at 22 degrees Fahrenheit, far lower than any almanac had predicted, lower than any frost in May that any living grower could remember. It was the kind of cold that froze the sap inside the wood, that burst the cell walls of the blossom pistils, that turned a living flower into a black, withered husk that would drop from the stem by noon. Out beyond Ronald's orchard, where no burlap covered the branches and no smoke hugged the ground, the cold did exactly that. Ronald did not see the devastation first. He heard it. As the eastern sky began to pale, he walked past his own meadow gate to the ridgeline that overlooked the valley, and the silence that met him was not the heavy silence of a cold morning. It was the silence of a place where all sound had been sucked away. No birdsong, no distant rooster from the Henderson farmsteads, no creak of wagon wheels on the road below. The valley lay beneath a white frost so thick it looked like a dusting of snow, but it was not snow. It was ice, crystallized directly from the moisture inside the apple blossoms, killing them from within. The entire basin glowed pale and corpse-like under the rising sun, and the ghostly white was speckled with black where the dead flowers had already begun to rot. Ronald stood on that ridge for a long time without moving. His own orchard behind him was still breathing. The smoke had settled into a dirty haze, but under it he could see the faint pink of living blossom, the green of budding leaves. The burlap, stiff with frost on the outside, had held the warmth in. The water trenches had released their stored heat through the coldest hours. His trees had survived. And he understood, standing there in the first gray light, that his survival now meant something far more complicated than vindication. Guild member Harlan Cross owned 80 acres of prime Baldwin 2 miles to the south. When the sun climbed high enough to light his orchard, the site was visible from the road, every single tree blackened as though torched. The blossoms hadn't wilted. They had shattered. The petals lay in frozen drifts beneath the trees, brittle as glass, while the centers where fruit should have formed were dark brown pools of dead tissue. Cross's foreman later said the temperature inside the blocks had fallen below 20 degrees for 4 consecutive hours. No smudge pot had been lit. No burlap had been hung. The guild's official advice had been to let the trees handle the cold naturally. A healthy tree can shake off a late frost, the almanac had promised. The almanac had been catastrophically wrong. By mid-morning, the scale of the disaster became legible. Henderson County alone lost an estimated 90% of its apple crop in a single night. The orchards that had laughed at Ronald Calder, that had called him a market manipulator, a fearmonger, a fool, now stood as monuments to their own certainty. The trees were not dead, but the year's harvest was gone. There would be no apples to ship to Pittsburgh, no cider to press, no bushels to sell to the rail lines. The futures contracts the Guild had so carefully negotiated were now obligations attached to fruit that did not exist. Bankers in Cincinnati who had extended credit against the season's crop would call in those loans by June. Dozens of families that had farmed the valley for 3 generations, were facing ruin before summer even began. And then there was Ronald Calder's orchard. 160 acres, 50 of them wrapped and smoked, still heavy with live bloom. The surviving buds would set fruit by June, and by September those trees would bend under a harvest that represented the only significant apple crop in the entire Ohio River Valley. His orchard had not merely survived. It had become a monopoly overnight. Word traveled faster than the thaw. By the time Ronald walked back down from the ridge, a small crowd had gathered at his gate, not the mocking neighbors of the day before, but hollow-faced men who had just walked through the wreckage of their own livelihoods. They stared at the burlap-wrapped trees as though seeing them for the first time. The smoke haze still hung low, and the ground beneath it was wet and warm compared to the frozen grass beyond the boundary. The difference was so stark it looked like a line drawn by a giant hand. Silas Burke, the only grower who had taken Ronald's warning seriously, had covered his own young trees and lit a half-dozen small fires. His orchard had suffered damage, the unprotected older blocks were lost, but his new Baldwin planting had pulled through. He stood at Ronald's gate now, not asking for congratulations but for guidance. The old trapper Elias Crow in the original story had observed and then told others the truth. Here, Silas would become the witness who spreads the word, but the guild members were not ready to praise Ronald. They were desperate, and desperation would soon turn to demands. Harlan Cross himself arrived before noon. His face was pale, not from cold but from the collapse of a world he had led. He had voted to strip Ronald of his guild rights, had publicly called his prediction dangerous nonsense. Now his own orchard was a graveyard, and the man he had banished was the only person in the valley who could save his family from bankruptcy. He did not apologize. He stood at the gate in his long black coat and asked Ronald to sell his future harvest at a fair price to the guild's brokers, to spread the survival across the community. Ronald looked at the man who had tried to destroy his reputation just 6 days earlier, and for the first time in that long, cold morning, he almost smiled. Not in cruelty, but in recognition of the irony so complete it felt like fate. The frost had not just killed blossoms, it had killed the old order. The guild's word no longer dictated reality in the Ohio Valley. Ronald Calder's trees now held the only future the valley's apple trade could count on. And the price of that future, the price of every bushel, every barrel, every shipment, had not yet been named. That would come next. Harlan Cross did not come alone. He brought 2 other guild elders with him, Thomas Hayward, who ran the largest cider press in the county, and Martin Bell, whose family had held the shipping contract to Pittsburgh for 27 years. They stood at Ronald Calder's gate in their dark coats, their faces pale with frostbite they hadn't suffered, and framed their request as a community obligation. The guild, they explained, would purchase Ronald's entire fall harvest at the standard pre-frost contract price, $4 per barrel for first-grade Baldwins, and distribute the fruit evenly among the valley's cider mills and rail buyers. This way, they argued, no single grower would profit from the calamity. The valley would share the loss and recover together. Ronald listened without interrupting. He had spent the morning walking the surviving blocks with his ledger, counting blossom clusters on a sample of trees, estimating yield per acre with the same cold precision he had once used to predict the frost. He knew exactly what his harvest was worth now. Standard pre-frost price was a joke, and Cross knew it. Without Ronald's apples, the Pittsburgh buyers would have nothing to ship. the cider mills nothing to press. The mills would close, the rail contracts would default, and the bankers would call every loan in the valley, good orchard or bad. The guild wasn't asking for charity. It was asking Ronald to absorb the cost of their own arrogance, to sell his crop at a price that erased his advantage and let the men who had banished him walk away whole. When Ronald finally spoke, his voice was calm. He did not refuse outright. He said he would consider the offer and give his answer in 3 days. Cross pressed for a commitment then and there, but Ronald simply looked past him toward the dead black orchard stretching across the valley, and Cross, perhaps seeing something in that gaze he did not want to test, withdrew. The three elders climbed back into their wagon and rode away through the gray, frozen morning. The moment they were gone, Margaret stepped out onto the porch. She had heard every word. "You're not going to give it to them," she said. It wasn't a question. "No," Ronald replied. "But I'm not going to give them nothing, either." He spent the next 2 days doing something far more dangerous than refusing the guild. He wrote letters to the Pittsburgh fruit brokers who had always dealt through the guild's appointed agents, to the independent cider press in Wheeling, West Virginia, that had been frozen out of the Valley contract for years, to the railroad freight office in Cincinnati, asking for a private rate on 60 rail cars of apples shipped direct, and to a man named August Kessler, a Swiss-born meteorologist who had been petitioning the state legislature for funds to build a weather observation station in the Ohio Valley, a station the guild had lobbied against 2 years earlier, calling it an expensive toy for a science that couldn't predict a thunderstorm, let alone a killing frost. Each letter was careful, measured, and utterly devastating to the old order. Ronald was not merely selling apples. He was building a new supply chain that bypassed the guild entirely, and he was doing it on the strength of a single harvest, a harvest that would be the largest commercially viable apple crop in the entire Ohio River Valley in the year of 1884. But the guild did not sit idle. On the third day, Thomas Hayward rode to the Hendersontown meeting and stood before the assembled growers to denounce Ronald Calder as a war profiteer, a man who had hoarded supplies, refused to share his prediction, and now intended to squeeze the valley for every dollar its dying families could scrape together. The accusation was a lie, but it was a lie that stuck because it offered the desperate a target for their rage. Ronald had shared his prediction. He had been expelled for it. But memory shortens quickly when starvation looms, and the guild knew it. Soon, talk began to circulate. Some men muttered about direct action, a euphemism that in the valley meant cutting fences, firing orchards, and worse. A crowd of 24 gathered at the Henderson Town Square, and a rancher named Whitcomb, who had lost his entire Baldwin planting, shouted that Ronald Calder had stolen the frost from them, had kept the warning to himself, and was now hoarding the only food that would carry their families through winter. The lie was absurd, but desperation has never needed logic. A stone was thrown. No one was hurt, but the sound of breaking glass against the meeting house window was enough to send a tremor through the valley. Ronald Calder's orchard, the one green patch in a sea of ruin, was no longer merely envied. It was threatened. Ronald learned of the meeting from Silas Burke, who rode through the dark to warn him. Silas stood in the kitchen, gulping coffee while Margaret listened silently. "They're saying you could have told them sooner, that you knew in April and held back. They're calling you a thief and a hoarder. There's talk of taking the fruit by force if you don't sell it cheap." Ronald took the news without visible reaction. He poured Silas another cup of coffee, then walked to the window and looked out across his burlap-wrapped trees. The evening light was fading, and the orchard looked strange, half fortress, half temple. The burlap still hung on the younger blocks, and the smudge pots sat in neat rows, cold now but ready for next spring. He had protected these trees with sweat and nerve and 30 years of notes that no one else had bothered to keep. Now the same men who had laughed at his fancy ideas wanted to take what those ideas had saved, and they wanted it for free, or as close to free as threats could make it. But here is the thing that would change everything. While the mob was gathering in Henderson, August Kessler, the meteorologist, was on a train from Columbus. He had received Ronald's letter, and more importantly, the package Ronald had enclosed. 10 years of weather logs, meticulously recorded, with correlations between lunar halos, cricket silence, and frost events that matched Kessler's own academic research more closely than anything the Professional Weather Service had produced in Ohio. Kessler was not coming to buy apples. He was coming to meet the man whose private data could prove, scientifically, irrefutably, that frost prediction was not superstition but measurable physics. Kessler arrived on the morning of May 8th, stepping off the Henderson platform with a leather satchel stuffed with barometric charts and thermometric records. He was a small, precise man with spectacles and a limp from a childhood fall, but his mind was one of the sharpest in American meteorology. He had spent 5 years trying to convince the federal government to fund local weather stations, and the Ohio Fruit Growers Guild had blocked him at every turn, calling his methods German theory and his predictions worse than guessing. When Kessler saw Ronald's ledgers, he did not simply read them. He spread them across the kitchen table, cross-referenced the dates of frost events with his own records from the Cincinnati Observatory, and within an hour his hands were trembling not with fear, but with the excitement of a man who has found the missing piece of a puzzle he has been assembling for a decade. The correlation was astonishing. Ronald's folk observations, cricket silence, ringed moon, glass light at dawn, were not independent omens. They were surface indicators of a specific atmospheric configuration, a high-pressure dome moving southeast from the Dakota Territory, pulling dry, cold air from the upper atmosphere into the Ohio Valley under clear skies. Kessler had the physics. Ronald had the field confirmation. Together, they had the architecture of a prediction system that could save millions of dollars in fruit crops every year. And then Kessler said something that shifted the entire axis of the conflict. The frost that had killed the Ohio Valley's apples had not been a local event. The same high-pressure system had swept across the entire Midwest. Orchard after orchard in Indiana, in Illinois, in southern Michigan, had been hit. The national apple harvest of 1884 was going to be the smallest in 30 years, perhaps the smallest on record. Ronald Calder's surviving Baldwin and Northern Spy blocks were not just the only significant crop in the Ohio Valley. They were among the only significant crops east of the Mississippi River. This was the "it gets worse" moment, or from Ronald's perspective, the moment that made everything larger and more dangerous. His apples were now worth far more than he had calculated. The Pittsburgh brokers, getting wind of the national shortage, were already wiring offers. The Wheeling cider press had replied offering to pay double the guild price, advance. If Ronald held his nerve, he could set a price that would make him one of the wealthiest orchardists in the state, while the men who had banished him and now threatened him would lose everything. Not because he had taken it, but because they had refused to listen. But a fortune built on a monopoly born of a disaster would come with a cost. If Ronald sold his crop at the maximum market price, the money would flow into his pocket, but the valley's social fabric, already tearing, would rip apart. Families would lose their land. Children would go hungry. Violence, the kind that had already knocked on his gate, would not stay outside forever. Ronald Calder had not merely survived a frost. He had stepped into a position where his next decision would determine whether he became a legend or a villain. It was Margaret who brought the ledger to the kitchen table that night, not the weather ledger but the farm accounts. She had been doing sums of her own. Even if Ronald sold just half the crop at the new high market rate, they could pay off every debt, buy the adjacent Henderson parcel that had come up for sale, and still have money left to retire in comfort. But she also saw the other numbers. How much each family in the valley owed, how many would default, how many children depended on the wages from the cider mills that would close without apples to press. She laid the two columns side by side and asked her husband a single question. "What do you want this harvest to build?" Ronald sat with that question through the night while the valley slept under a sky that was, for the first time in 10 days, fully clear of frost. Kessler slept in the guest room, his satchel full of data that would change meteorology. The burlap still hung on the trees. The smudge pot stood ready. And in the town of Henderson, men were sharpening their knives and their grievances, waiting for a man who had been right about the weather to prove them right about his character. But Ronald Calder was not merely choosing between greed and generosity. He was designing a third option, an option that would use the profit not to enrich himself or to bail out the guild, but to build something permanent, something that would ensure no grower in the valley would ever again have to choose between trusting an almanac and trusting an outcast. The weather station Kessler had dreamed of, the one the guild had killed, could be built with private funds. The data Ronald had collected across 30 springs could become the foundation of a local prediction network that would save crops for generations. And the guild, the institution that had banished him, would have no power to stop it, because the money would not be theirs to control. Just before dawn, Ronald woke Kessler and laid out his proposal. He would sell his apples at a price high enough to fund the construction of a full meteorological station, instruments, a telegraph line for storm warnings, a paid observer, and still leave his family with enough to secure their future. The profit would not go into land speculation or personal luxury. It would go into a public trust, a village weather station that would warn every grower, guild member or not, of the next black frost. Ronald would dictate the price of fruit not to punish the valley, but to build the very institution that could have prevented its destruction. Kessler stared at the rough sketch Ronald had drawn on the back of a barn invoice. A small stone building on the ridge above the orchard, a wind vane, a rain gauge, a barometer room, a name, the Calder Valley Weather Station. It was audacious, improbable, and precisely the kind of idea that got a man expelled from a guild for having too much imagination. But Ronald wasn't asking permission anymore. The price of the apples would be announced at noon, and when the valley heard the number, they would know that the man they had mocked had not merely beaten the frost. He had decided to change the weather forever. The bell in the Henderson meeting house rang at noon, not for a funeral or a town call, but because it was the only way to gather the valley when every wagon and horse was already moving. Word had leaked before Ronald ever opened his mouth. The Pittsburgh brokers had wired their offer. The Wheeling cider press had telegraphed a rate. The freight company had confirmed 60 railcars reserved for the Calder harvest alone. By the time Ronald climbed onto the bed of his hay wagon in front of the meeting house, half the growers in the county had gathered, their faces a mix of hunger, anger, and the particular shame of men who had mocked a prophet and now needed his mercy to survive. Harlan Cross stood at the front, his dark coat still buttoned tight, his hands clasped behind his back, a man who had not yet accepted that the world had shifted under his feet. Thomas Hayward flanked him, scowling, and Martin Bell held a ledger like a shield. The crowd parted as Ronald stepped up. He carried no paper, no prepared speech. He simply stood on that wagon bed in his worn wool coat, the same coat he had worn through the night of the frost, and let the silence build until even the horses stopped stamping. "You all know what happened," he said. "You know what I told the guild on April 29th. You know what they told me. And you know what the frost did to every orchard that wasn't wrapped." A murmur rippled through the crowd, but no one spoke. Ronald let the silence answer for him. "The crop I have is the only one in this valley. It's the only one within 200 miles that can fill the Pittsburgh contract, the Wheeling contract, and the rail cars that are already waiting on the siding. The buyers have named their prices. They're high, higher than any barrel of Baldwin's has ever sold in this valley. I could sell every bushel at that price and walk away with more money than I'd ever need." He paused again, scanning the faces. He saw men who had laughed at him. He saw Silas Burke standing near the back, the only man who had listened. He saw Margaret and his son standing beside the wagon, their faces steady. And he saw the fear, the raw, bone-deep fear of families facing winter with no income and no crop. "But I'm not going to sell at the market price," he said. "And I'm not giving the harvest away either." Thomas Hayward stepped forward. "Then what do you want, Calder? Name it." Ronald reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper, the rough sketch he had drawn with Kessler that morning. He held it up so the crowd could see the lines. A small stone building on the ridge, a flagpole, a weather vane, a barometer room. The reason the frost caught us blind is that the Guild has spent 2 years blocking the weather observation station that August Kessler asked the state to fund. You called it a toy. You called his methods foreign nonsense. You refused to pay $20 a year to install a telegraph line that would have given us warning from Cincinnati a full day before that cold mass hit the valley. If that station had been running, every man here could have wrapped his trees. Not one orchard would be black today. He let that land. Cross's face reddened, but he didn't deny it. He couldn't. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm selling my apples at a price high enough to build that station, right here in Henderson County, on land I'm donating on the ridge above my orchard. The station will be owned by the valley, not by the Guild and not by me. It'll have a telegraph wire to the Cincinnati Observatory, a paid observer, and a signal flag system that will warn every grower in this county of a killing frost before the sun sets the day before. It will be ready by next spring, and it will run on an endowment funded by this harvest. He named the price per barrel. It was not the maximum the brokers had offered, but it was well above the Guild's pre-frost $4. It was precisely the number Margaret had worked out at the kitchen table, enough to build the station, endow it for 10 years of operation, pay off the farm's debts, and still leave the Calder family with a modest reserve. Every cent above that number, he explained, would be returned to the growers who bought his apples through a reduced rate the following year. The crowd went dead silent. This was not generosity exactly. It was not revenge either. It was something harder and more disciplined, justice with a ledger. Ronald Calder was not forgiving the Guild. He was replacing it. The station would break the Guild's monopoly on weather information because the Guild had proven that it could not be trusted with that information. And the price, while steep, was still lower than the bankruptcy every family would face if they had no fruit to sell at all. Harlan Cross, voice tight, asked, "And if we refuse? If the Guild decides to find fruit elsewhere?" Ronald looked at him without anger. "Find it, but you'll be buying from Pittsburgh, paying rail freight in both directions, and your mills will close before the first shipment arrives. Or you can buy from me, and by this time next year, every one of you will have a warning before the next frost. You'll never have to trust an almanac again. You'll have a signal on the hill." The vote, when it came, was not taken by the Guild Council. It was taken by the growers themselves, standing in the town square, their farms black behind them. One by one, they stepped forward to sign the purchase agreements Ronald had already prepared in neat, careful writing. Silas Burke signed first without hesitation. Others followed, some with gratitude, some with resentment barely concealed, but all with the knowledge that there was no other door open. Thomas Hayward refused. He announced that his cider press would source from Indiana, which he knew to be impossible, and stormed away. Martin Bell followed him. Harlan Cross stood alone for a long time, staring at the sketch of the weather station as though it were a personal insult carved in ink. Finally, without a word, he took the pen and signed. The Guild, as the valley had known it, a closed council of elders who spoke for the heavens, had just breathed its last. The harvest came in September. Ronald's Baldwins hung red and heavy on branches that had survived the freeze because they had been wrapped in burlap on a night when every other grower had slept. The pickers filled crate after crate, and the rail cars rolled east with the only significant apple shipment from the Ohio Valley in 1884. The checks arrived at the Henderson Bank, and the funds were divided exactly as Ronald had promised. The largest portion to the escrow account for the station, a fair share to the family, and a reserve for the following year's operations. August Kessler stayed for 6 weeks, personally overseeing the construction of the stone building on the ridge. It was small, 12 feet by 15, but it held a barometer, a thermograph, a rain gauge, and an anemometer that spun in the basin wind that had once killed an entire valley's hope. The telegraph line was strung on new poles, and the first test message from Cincinnati arrived on October 3rd, a cold front forecast for the following Tuesday. Ronald climbed to the station himself, read the slip, and raised the warning flag, a red pennant with a black border, visible from every orchard within 3 miles. The signal system was alive. The first frost of the following spring hit on April 28, 1885, almost exactly 1 year after Ronald's prediction. This time, when the red flag rose on the ridge, every grower in the valley saw it. They wrapped their trees, lit their smudge pots, and saved the bloom. Not a single orchard was lost. The station had cost the growers a premium price for a single harvest, but it saved the next decade's harvests before they even hung heavy on the branch. Ronald Calder did not live to see the full legacy of what he built. He died in 1902, at 75 years old, still tending his Baldwins, still logging dates and temperatures in the leather-bound ledgers that had started it all. Margaret survived him by 6 years. Caleb took over the orchard, and Elijah became the second paid observer at the station, reading barometers and raising flags for a valley that had long since stopped laughing at the name Calder. The Calder Valley Weather Station operated continuously from 1885 until 1941, when the Federal Weather Bureau absorbed its functions into a regional network. By then, the principal Ronald had proved that local observation, carefully recorded and scientifically cross-referenced, could predict killing frosts before they struck, had become standard practice across the entire American fruit belt. The station's logs, kept for 56 years, became one of the longest continuous climate records in the Midwest, studied by meteorologists for decades after the stone building itself had been repurposed as a county archive. But the detail that lingered longest in the valley's memory was not the station or the signal flags or even the night of smoke and burlap that saved the harvest. It was the fact that Ronald Calder, after everything, after the mockery and the expulsion and the mob that called him a thief, had still chosen to build something that protected the very men who had tried to destroy him. Not out of forgiveness, exactly. Out of a colder, more stubborn conviction that the truth, once proven, belonged to everyone, even to the people who had fought hardest against hearing it. The Baldwin trees he planted in 1868 are mostly gone now, replaced by new plantings, then houses, then time. The stone station still stands on the ridge, its weather vane rusted but intact. And in the county records, you can still find the deed of trust Ronald Calder filed in 1885, setting aside the land and the endowment for the public warning of killing frosts in perpetuity. The language is lawyerly, but the intent is unmistakable. A man who had been banished for seeing the future decided to give that future to the people who had banished him, not as a gift, but as a foundation. A bet that good information, freely shared, could do what guilds and almanacs and angry crowds could not: keep the trees alive when the cold came silent. The story of Ronald Calder survives not because one man outsmarted a frost, but because it exposes a pattern that repeats wherever human beings mistake consensus for truth. The guild did not fail because its members were stupid or malicious. They failed because they had built a system that punished deviation from the group, that confused seniority with wisdom, that treated a single anomalous voice as a threat rather than an asset. The almanac was wrong. The official forecast was wrong. The collective judgment of experienced men was wrong. Ronald Calder, armed with nothing but a notebook and the patience to watch crickets and moons, was right. And the cost of that rightness was near total banishment before the frost ever touched a petal. What makes the pattern so durable is that it feels reasonable in the moment. Every grower in that meeting hall had good cause to distrust a lone prediction that contradicted every authority they knew. The almanac had served them for decades. The Cincinnati Bureau had telegraph wires and professional training. Ronald Calder had a ring around the moon and a theory about still crickets. To bet the harvest on his word would have felt reckless, but the recklessness was not in the betting. It was in the refusal to even examine the evidence he had gathered. The guild didn't merely disagree with Ronald. It silenced him before the test could happen. That is the move that turns a difference of opinion into an institutional failure. And here is the uncomfortable question that lingers in the valley long after the frost has melted. How many other Ronald Calders have been expelled from how many other rooms, carrying predictions that would have saved lives, crops, markets, or nations, If only someone had been willing to listen before the disaster proved them right. The prophet banished today often becomes the expert we wish we had consulted yesterday. The pattern is so common it has become a cliché of tragedy, yet it plays out again and again because conformity is comfortable and eccentricity is easy to mock. Ronald Calder did not merely save his orchard. He demonstrated that the margin between ruin and survival can be the width of a single person's willingness to observe carefully and speak honestly, even when speaking honestly costs them their reputation. The burlap and the smudge pots were important, but the truly radical act was the 30 years of note-taking that preceded the crisis. He didn't guess. He correlated. He tested his correlations against past events, refined his indicators, and kept his conclusions quiet until the evidence was overwhelming. The guild called it superstition because it looked like folklore, crickets, moon halos, the color of dawn, but it was empiricism in homespun form. The tragedy is that the guild couldn't tell the difference. When the station flag rose on that ridge for the first time, it signaled more than a cold front. It signaled a shift in who gets to know what and who gets to warn whom. The old gatekeepers, the almanac compilers, the guild elders, the far-off forecasters in Cincinnati were no longer the sole authorities on the valley's weather. The data was local, the observation was continuous, and the warning was visible to everyone, regardless of guild membership. Ronald Calder had not just predicted a frost, he had democratized prediction itself. So perhaps the deepest lesson of the Calder story is not about frost or apples or even courage. It is about the architecture of truth in a community. Truth that is hoarded or silenced benefits no one. Truth that is shared, even at a cost, becomes infrastructure. Ronald could have kept his knowledge private, sold his apples at the maximum price, and retired wealthy while his neighbors went under. Instead, he took the profit and built a public good that would outlast his own orchard, his own lifetime, and the guild that had tried to crush him. That choice moved him from the category of survivor into the category of founder. The stone building still stands. The ledgers are in the county archive. The weather vane still points into the same wind that once carried a killing frost across an unprotected valley. And the question that the story leaves with anyone who hears it is not whether Ronald Calder was brilliant or merely stubborn. It is what warnings are being ignored right now, in this season, in this place, because the person who sounds the alarm looks too strange, thinks too differently, or refuses to bow to the consensus that feels so safe and is so catastrophically wrong. If stories like this remind us of anything, it's that the people who see around corners are rarely welcomed in the moment they speak up. But history, again and again, builds monuments to them anyway. Subscribe and join us for more stories of the outcasts who were right before anyone believed them.